Let's start studying the steps involved in a little more detail. The first thing that you need to do is identify a trading opportunity. What do we do when we're looking for a trading opportunity? We need to assess what the market is currently doing. And we do that starting with the daily chart by understanding that an 80-day cycle trough formed over here at the beginning of January. Price crossed above the signal cycle FLD, the 20-day cycle FLD, reached towards its target but has not yet reached it. So we have an outstanding target for the 20-day cycle sitting above us. Do we expect that target to be achieved? We pretty much do, because the market has been very bullish. Look at this very good bullish cycle shape. It is now bouncing out of an 80-day cycle trough. Of course, we might see a symmetrical price action with the market turning down, but that would be a little unusual in my opinion, and so for now we are probably expecting price to reach up to this 20-day cycle target. Of course, we have another 40-day cycle target up here, but seeing as we're looking at the 5-minute chart, we're not really too worried about that. It's useful to know that we have targets to the upside. What about what is happening on this daily chart? Here you can see, and we'll need to zoom in on this chart. Again, I'm looking at screenshots that have been automatically taken so that we can cover all the different time frames and step through the bars. But you will notice that price has come down to the signal cycle FLD, which is expected to provide support. Notice the upward pointing arrows. And so, price is coming in, possibly into a 20-day cycle trough. It is expected to find support at the level of this 20-day cycle FLD. That is our situation on the daily chart. Let's step down to the 4-hour chart to explore a little more detail. We don't need to spend a very long time studying each one of these charts in case you think, gosh, we're going to have to do this every 5 minutes. You certainly don't. We're just simply setting the scene at the beginning of our trading day, perhaps. And so it's a brief glance at each one of these charts to take in the situation. Here is our 80-day cycle trough at the beginning of January. Notice how price achieved the 10-day cycle target, and it has been pretty much flatlining since then. What about this nest of lows? That's interesting. Price should be forming a 10-day cycle trough, and it's fairly overdue. Look at this 5-day cycle target over here. Possibly this is our 10-day cycle trough. However, that trough has not yet been found. And look what happened after the potential formation of that 10-day cycle trough. Price came up, found resistance at the level of the FLD, the signal FLD. That's not really what should be happening following a 10-day cycle trough, and so it is possible that that 10-day cycle trough still lies ahead of us. We've got some support in the form of this 20-day cycle FLD. We saw that 20-day cycle FLD on the daily chart. It's in a slightly different position on our 4-hour chart, and it's indicating that it lies slightly ahead of us. Notice this rather interesting 80-day cycle target from the daily chart. That's because price has just crept below that 80-day cycle FLD. It's an interesting target. It's sitting down there below price action, and it's at about the level of this 20-day FLD on the 4-hour chart. So certainly that's a price level to watch. Here is the 20-day cycle target from our daily chart. So what are we doing here? We're just getting an idea of what the cycle situation is in the market at the moment. So let's jump to our hourly chart and consider what is happening there. On the hourly chart, our analysis is a bit of a mess. Look at this trough over here beneath that trough. And there's no cycle trough that has been found beneath this trough. Here we have circles floating above one another, a staggered nest of lows. So we have a bit of a mess on the hourly chart. What are we expecting? According to the hourly chart, we're looking for this 5-day cycle trough. We have a 10-day cycle target that comes from the 4-hour chart sitting below current price action. Is it possible, we ask ourselves, that the 5-day cycle trough formed over here? Certainly we've got those targets being achieved. Yes, it's possible, and we had quite a nice clean move up to this 1-day cycle target over here, and then we had a nice M shape, but we're back at the level at which we started. That's not really a very good look for a bounce out of a 5-day cycle trough. And so we don't get any very clear information from this chart. Sometimes that happens on some of your time frames, but we keep going and we look at the next shorter time frame, the 30-minute time frame. And now here on the 30-minute time frame, we can see that the 5-day cycle trough has indeed been found at this position over here. But notice what is happening now on the 30-minute time frame. Price has reached up. It has found the signal cycle FLD. This is the 12-hour cycle FLD. And it has found clear resistance. It is moving down from there. That is not what we would expect if the 5-day cycle trough is indeed lying behind us. And so we do not yet have absolute clarity. Let's look at the 15-minute chart. The 15-minute chart is interesting because it has placed the 5-day cycle trough beneath this low point over here, and we had a good interaction, a price cross above the FLD, which actually achieved its target very neatly. But having achieved its target, price dropped like a stone, as you can see, dropped straight down through the FLD, met the target on the way down, and has now dropped down to a lower price. The situation is looking mixed. It seems very unlikely that the 5-day cycle trough is here. It seems likely that it might have just formed over here, or perhaps still lies ahead of us. Finally, we'll step down to the 5-minute chart and see what is happening there. The 5-minute chart is where we're going to start making some trading decisions. The first thing we need to do is identify our opportunity. The 5-minute chart has inherited information. It's taken information from the longer charts, and it has the 5-day cycle trough behind us, which, as I've just pointed out, is a little questionable. It has now also found a 6-hour cycle trough, which is, of course, our sequence cycle on this chart. The 6-hour cycle, our sequence cycle, triggers the start of the identification of a trading opportunity, because we are trading the sequence of interactions between the signal cycle and price that plays out over the sequence cycle. And so the first step to identifying our trading opportunity is to find this kind of situation where we have a trough that is of at least sequence cycle magnitude. In other words, on the 5-minute chart, it must be at least a 6-hour cycle, that green cycle trough. Our trading opportunity is an A category long trade. And so by stepping down the time frames, we've identified our opportunity. However, you need to stay alert to what is happening on your charts. There were some discrepancies, weren't there, on that 15-minute chart? We have a potential 6-hour cycle trough over here, which is lower than the 5-day cycle trough that occurred only 6 hours ago. That doesn't really make sense, does it? Because the first 6-hour cycle trough following the 5-day cycle trough should surely be higher than the 5-day cycle trough. If that doesn't make sense to you, I would suggest you go back and review the basics about the FLD and the way in which the cycles combine. So, although we have identified a trading opportunity, I am a little suspicious of that trading opportunity. So what we're going to do is we're going to step forward on this chart and see what happens on the 5-minute chart. I should point out when it is that we are considering this trading opportunity. We are considering this opportunity just before the US markets open. Now, the markets are going to open on the next bar, and when the markets open, we will expect some volatility. So it is unlikely that we're going to trade in the first 5-minute bar. So let's step forward and see how the US markets open. There we go. You see what I mean by increased volatility. Price came all the way up, almost to this FLD. Notice how it didn't quite touch the FLD, and then it dropped down sharply. Notice too how our analysis on this chart has changed. We now have the 6-hour cycle trough as a nest of lows, and price is plunging its way into that nest of lows. I'm feeling a little better about this. That trading opportunity just didn't seem quite right. I'd feel even better seeing as price has dropped down into a new low if we acknowledge the fact that the 5-day cycle trough is probably only forming now, which means we are going to be trying to catch a 5-day cycle trough. Catching a 5-day cycle trough is quite an exhilarating process, so let's see if we can do it. So let's keep stepping forward. We still have the same trading opportunity in mind, don't we? We have an A category long trading opportunity as price bounces out of what might potentially be a 6-hour cycle trough, but probably is going to end up being the 5-day cycle trough that we're looking for. So let's step forward again on our 5-minute chart and see what happens. You will notice all these targets being met. That is interesting information. As targets are met, it is certainly a sign that the cycle impetus for those different cycles is being fulfilled. But of course, that doesn't mean that the market is going to stop in its tracks. So let's keep stepping forward. We've had a really strong move down. At this point, you might be thinking, goodness, I should have jumped into a short trade earlier. Yes, perhaps you should, and we will loop back in a separate video and consider how you might have done that if you had started trading this situation several hours earlier. But let's keep stepping forward with this particular trading opportunity. You will notice something here, and I'm sorry about the scaling of this chart. They're automatic screen grabs, as I've mentioned. The 80-day cycle target for the daily chart, which I pointed out earlier when we were looking at the 4-hour chart, I think, has now been reached. Isn't that interesting? So we're looking at price coming down into a 5-day cycle trough. We're hitting an 80-day cycle target. As I pointed out, that 80-day target was because of price just creeping beneath that FLD. In fact, the interaction that we're expecting, and let's quickly go back to the daily chart to discuss this. The interaction that we're expecting with the 80-day cycle FLD, the sequence cycle FLD on our daily chart, is, as you can see, an E category interaction. In other words, price should be crossing up above it. So why do we have this 80-day cycle target below it? An interesting thing has happened. Price did cross up above that FLD, but it has in the recent bar, the median price has just slipped below it, generating a very insubstantial target to the downside. But it's an interesting thing how those seemingly insignificant targets are often reached. And we have just seen evidence of that on our 5-minute chart. Let's go back to it. So there is that 80-day cycle target that has been achieved. We're still expecting only a 6-hour cycle trough on this analysis, but by now it should be apparent that the trough that we're looking for is definitely the 5-day cycle trough, because we're much lower than the previous one that was found on the 5-minute chart. We'll take a look at the longer time frame charts again in a moment and just update our situation on that. But let's keep stepping forward on this 5-minute chart. We still have the same A category opportunity. We're quite a long way away from it, but we are still looking for it. So let's step forward. Price keeps moving down. And here we get the first sign that something might be changing in the market. We have this engulfing bar where price came down and then came up above it. And so it is certainly possible that we have a trough forming. So let's reconsider the opportunity that we have here. Let's run through our different time frames again. Here is a 4-hour chart. Here is this strong move down that we've just seen on the 5-minute chart. Again, we have a 10-day cycle trough on the 4-hour chart, which is over here. That's the 10-day cycle trough. But it seems likely that that 10-day cycle trough is actually only going to form now. Notice the sequence FLD on the 4-hour chart, which is of course the 20-day FLD, is expecting the BC category interaction. Remember when we started our consideration of the trading opportunity for today, I mentioned that that 20-day FLD is expected to provide support. Prices just dropped down below that FLD on the 4-hour chart, and we are of course expecting support here. Looking at the hourly chart, we still have the same confusion as before in terms of the analysis. Here you can see the target that has been reached. And so again, we don't get much information from the hourly chart. But looking at the 30-minute chart, we see what we were expecting, which is this nest of lows for the 5-day cycle trough beneath price where it is at the moment. That cycle trough is a little late, and earlier we were considering this price trough as being the potential 5-day cycle trough. But as I pointed out when we were last looking at this 30-minute chart, the fact that price found resistance at the level of the FLD was an indication that price was likely to continue down to form the sequence cycle trough, which would of course be also the 5-day cycle trough. And so back to our 5-minute chart. We have a sequence cycle nest of lows down at the foot of this chart. It's only a 6-hour cycle, but we are considering the possibility that this is in fact a 5-day cycle trough, perhaps even a 10-day cycle trough that is forming. That gives us increased confidence in this trading opportunity. Look at our string of green lights that we have. We have an A category interaction looming on our signal cycle FLD. We have an E category interaction on our mid-cycle FLD. And we also have acceleration points on our sequence cycle FLD. So this is our trading opportunity. We are expecting price to bounce out of this trough, which is a trough of at least sequence cycle magnitude on the chart that we are trading. And that's important. It must be at least a green cycle that we see in the nest of lows at the foot of our chart. Of course, the more diamonds or circles and whiskers that we have here, and we are thinking that this could go all the way up to a 5-day cycle trough, so we could have many more circles and whiskers there, as we saw a moment ago on the 30-minute chart. And so we have a potentially good trading opportunity. But, as I mentioned in the basic concepts video, we don't jump into a long trade on the possibility that a trough is forming. We need to watch price action unfold, and we need to see how price reacts when it gets to the signal cycle FLD. And that is when we start considering our trade entry.